war. And what is Fidel Castro's legacy? The great Cuban leader who, of course, died last weekend. Let's listen to some of the reaction from around the world. Remember, this is being streamed live on Facebook, on PressTV's Facebook page, and on my own, and you can comment, and some of them will come up here on the comment wall. Some reactions then from Western leaders to Castro's death.
The president has decided not to send a presidential delegation to attend the memorial service today. I can tell you, however, that Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes will attend the service, as will the top U.S. diplomat in Cuba, Jeff De Laurentiis.
Churlish, ungracious, certainly. But it was different in Canada, at least until there was a backlash against what was said by the Prime Minister of Canada, who, as a child, was a regular visitor and attendee at the knee of Fidel Castro. Let's see what happened to the north in Canada.
Do you think Fidel Castro was a dictator?
Yes.
And your statement yesterday reflected that?
The fact is, Fidel Castro had a deep and lasting impact on the Cuban people. He certainly was a polarizing figure, and there certainly were significant concerns around human rights. That's something that I'm open about and that I've highlighted. But on the passing of his death, I expressed a statement that highlighted the deep connection between the people of Canada and the people of Cuba. And at the same time, Canadians know that I always talk about human rights, including here yesterday, including with Raul Castro 2 weeks ago, including wherever I go around the world. I believe in positive, constructive engagement in the world, and that means being open and direct in our assessments, in our challenges, in our points of disagreement, while at the same time being consistent with the kind of respect that Canadians expect from their Prime Minister.
Looking rather like a young Fidel Castro himself there, Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, whose father and mother were big supporters and friends of Cuba and of Fidel Castro. The Prime Minister of Canada made a very gracious contribution the day before, but that was him on the run in the face of the hypocrites of the media. People who tell you, for example, that there's torture in Cuba. There is torture in Cuba. And the only place that there is torture in Cuba is in the American hellhole called Guantanamo Bay. Now, let's get some more balanced analysis from a very fine writer, Javier Farje, international analyst, Latin American himself, and a man with a close knowledge of the reality in Cuba. Javier, thanks very much for joining us. What do you make of the tidal wave of hypocrisy from Western leaders in relation to the death of Fidel Castro?
It's because Fidel Castro won every single war waged against him, and they can't stand that. The influence that Fidel Castro had in Latin America, whether there's reforms in some political systems, the left-wing government that came out from the late 1990s with Hugo Chavez, the health service and the education system that prevails in Cuba, no country in the West has that kind of level of education and health, and they can't stomach that reality. Now, of course, every government makes mistakes. You can't deny that. Even Fidel himself recognized that some of elements of the economic plan that they had not worked. He had the courage to do that. I don't really see how, I cannot imagine Theresa May admitting that she's made mistakes in the economy, because they don't do that. So, of course, there's double standards we're talking about here. You're talking about Guantanamo, yes, it's a center of torture, which President Obama never promised to close and never did. And in Latin America, no Latin American country, George, no Latin American country has the kind of health and education system that Cuba has. Not a single one has that. But they prefer to talk about the negative side of it to be able to swipe under the carpet their own underachievements. And it is actually double standards, as you mentioned. Fidel influence, they are going to hate it, but Fidel's role in the history of Latin America of the second half of the 20th century is guaranteed. Whether they like it or not, whether they hate him or not, it is guaranteed. Many reforms at the end of the 60s, implemented ironically by military governments in Peru and Panama, were inspired by Fidel Castro. Land reform, participation of the communities, etc. They happened in Panama and Peru. And the governments that came after 1999 with President Chavez, then Bolivia with Evo Morales, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, they all were inspired by the ideas and the social changes that Fidel Castro, implemented in Cuba and wanted to implement, and inspire Latin America. So they can shout as much as they like about Fidel, they can say whatever they like, but those achievements are part of the history of Latin America, and you cannot wipe out history because it's there in black and white, but also in concrete achievements. And they can say whatever they like, they can shout as much as they like. You have seen the funerals of Fidel Castro. All these leaders coming from all over the place. Africa, for example. Apartheid would have taken longer to end without the intervention of Cuba in Angola. And, that's why Mandela was so loyal.
Even, of course, Fidel's enemies in Latin America were open that insofar as they themselves were prepared to introduce, for example, land reform, that they were doing it because if they didn't do it, the Castroists would do it for them.
Exactly. Are you actually quoting a general from the Peruvian army in 1969 when the military took over? They took over in October 1968. People who had fought the guerrillas inspired by Fidel Castro, they took power in 1968 in Peru, and they implemented a land reform. And one general said, when he was asked, why are you doing that? He said, well, because if we don't do that, the Castroists will do it, and we must as well do it ourselves. In a way, of course, they wanted to do it to prevent a socialist land reform, but that's in itself an influence of the thought of Fidel Castro in these army people who ironically became good friends of Cuba because they realized there's something interesting going on in Cuba. The same Torrijos in Panama. He felt inspired by Fidel Castro. They were the only, and there was a government in Bolivia and also in Ecuador at the time, which were ironically military left-wing governments that got inspired by Fidel Castro. So we're talking about a wide range of inspiration from intellectuals, army officers, reformers, thinkers who have been inspired by the revolution that he led. And there's nothing anyone can do about that because that's part of the history of Latin America. Nobody can take away that from him.
Amin. Javier Farje, international analyst, grateful to you for joining us on Comment. Let's go to Canada. Hassan is in